episode of the Darwin Bandits. You made it through the week, and now we're hitting the long Labor Day weekend, and we have a dynamite episode for you today. Why? Well, we got a big name. Mr. Filip Sablik is on the show today. Philip is the former president of publishing and marketing for Boom Studios, and he's making news. Last week, news broke. He is working with, and let me get the information right here, teaming up with Jamie S. Rich, Jeremy Haun, and Eric Gitter for a new unnamed company. Hollywood's buzzing about this, comic books are buzzing about this, and we have him to talk about his career, the decision to leave Boom, and how do you put together your own company? What are you looking for to do with something like that? It's a little bit of uncharted waters, but he's ready to do it, and everyone's excited about it. We're excited about it. So here's Philip Sablik. Sir, thank you so much for taking the time.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
So let's start at the very beginning. How do you first discover comics?
How do I first discover comics? I had the good fortune of, I think, kind of stepping into comics at a peak period, which was 1990. Uh, I, I grew up in Southwest Virginia in a city called Roanoke, and I use the term city fairly loosely, but it was the largest metropolitan area in that corner of the state. And because it was the late 80s, early 90s, and comics were booming, there was actually like four or five comic shops in the area at the time. And I didn't grow up a comic book fan. In 1990, I was late 89, early 90, I was heading into middle school. And growing up, I'd moved around quite a bit. And so I was an avid and voracious reader. And I would read fantasy, science fiction, like pretty much anything I could get my hands on. And my mom definitely took advantage of the fact that you go to the library and check out a bunch of books, and that would keep me occupied for a few days, and then she'd take me back. So I have like a vague memory of probably picking up the occasional hardcover bound collection of classic Marvel comics or things like that. But that wasn't really the thing that made me a comic book reader. The thing that made me a comic book reader was homeroom of sixth grade. A bunch of different elementary schools are coming together into this big middle school. Everybody's feeling anxious. And so I'm sitting in homeroom, and I think I'm probably in the first or second row. And because I was nervous, I was reading. I had a book out and I was reading. And it happened to be, do you remember when the Tim Burton Batman film, the first film in '89 came out? There was all this like consumer products and different merchandise you could get. And one of the things you could get was a paperback of short stories written like not comic stories, but like short prose stories written by a bunch of science fiction and comic book writers and I had that because I think I picked it up at like a yard sale or something like that. And I was reading it, and two or three rows back, the kid that would become one of my best friends from middle school on saw me reading it and assumed because I was reading a Batman like spin-off book that I must be a comic book reader. And this guy, John Mahoney, came up to me very excited, during the break after homeroom. Was like, "You're a comic book fan?" I was like, no. He's like, "Well, I'm a comic book reader and we're going to be friends." And within I think a couple weeks, it probably hooked me on his collection of late 80s uh, X-Men comics, which is a great, fantastic, great gateway drug into comics.
So, how in your life is the decision then made to pursue a career in the industry?
That also, oddly enough, ties back to middle school and John Mahoney. As most middle school kids who were into comics at that uh, point in time, at some point we got it into our head that like, oh, maybe we should make our own comic books. And he and I and one other friend, we were trying to decide who would do what because we understood enough that comics was an assembly line and a collaborative process, and we all did sketches of like these superhero characters that we wanted to draw, and mine were like marginally better than the other two guys, and so they were like, well, then you're the artist, and John was like, I'll be the writer, and our buddy Andy will do the coloring. um, and that kind of coincided with taking art classes and really enjoying that. And so um, pretty quickly, uh, you know, the second half of middle school and high school, art really became the thing that I was most passionate about and pursuing. And um, it coincided with the era of Wizard magazine. So I was getting that every month and understanding that, there was such a thing as conventions and submission editors. And there were, all these stories of people breaking into comics. And again, it's kind of the heady days of the early 90s. So you're hearing these stories about, some kid who put together a portfolio and, went to a signing and showed it to, Rob Liefeld or Jim Lee or Todd McFarlane, and all of a sudden they were a working professional at 18. So it all seemed oddly within reach, even though in Roanoke, Virginia, it wasn't like a career path that anybody would have told you could have pursued. Um, so yeah, so I originally had a dream of being an artist in comics and pursued that very passionately. I was telling some friends the other day that I was the kid that from probably the time I was 14 years old until the time I was 18 or 19 years old, I sent a submission packet of samples every single month through like tail end of middle school and high school. And I was like clockwork, 6 to 10 pages. Just I would find sample scripts or I would eventually make them up when I ran out of ones that I could find. And really pursued that. Went to art school, and again with the idea that I would be a professional penciler. And then the way that I tell the story typically, which is everyone has these like aha moments, right? When you're becoming an adult, you have kind of your aspirations and your dreams as a teenager, and then there's always a kind of an inflection point. And mine was I went to the Maryland Institute College of Art and was lucky enough to go through that illustration program. Did pretty well in it. Um, Actually had I don't know if you know who Jose Villarrubia is, but he's a fantastic colorist. He's a professor there, so I had a chance to study with him. And I'm sitting in my senior thesis class in the last few weeks of school, getting ready to graduate, and all the illustration students have their work up on the walls, right? By the way, if you ever want to develop a thick skin, highly recommend art school because it's like basically like putting your soul up on a wall once a week and having people eviscerate it and tell you everything that's wrong with it. And so it makes you really good at kind of taking feedback and applying it. But anyway, I'm sitting there, I'm looking at this wall of probably 25, 30 different students' works. And it occurs to me as I'm staring at it, I'm like, I'm better than those like 10 people right there. Oh man, but I'm nowhere near as good as those 10 people right there. And the chilling understanding that I was very firmly average. Like I was just right in the middle. And it occurred to me that, well, if I'm gonna kind of become a working artist, I'm probably uh, going to have to rely maybe on my ability to network and have a conversation, and you know, and I think at that point I had heard kind of the old adage that if you want to be a working illustrator or working comic book artist, you need to be two out of three things. And those three things are on time, good, and nice. And very rarely you'll find somebody like Dan Mora who's all three. But I knew I could be, if not fast, at least reliable and nice. So I was like, okay, well maybe I can rely on that. But in the meantime, I better find a day job, which is how I ended up at Diamond Comic Distributors.
Right.
There, that's the somewhat unadulterated version of how I fell into a career in comics.
Well, let me ask you this because, we're going to talk more about the different points of your career, but if you had just had a career as a penciler or as a writer, where you are right now, would you be satisfied with that? Or did you feel the need inside to pursue higher and higher levels in this industry?
If you had asked me at 21, 22 years old, I would have told you that, you being a working artist or working creator would have been my dream. And subsequently, I had the privilege and the good fortune to work with a lot of incredibly talented writers and artists, see the process. I've had the chance to write and draw um, a handful of comic books over my career. And so the me that is sitting here today looks at that career path and says, I don't think that I would have um, been satisfied if most of my day was sitting at a drawing board or sitting at a computer screen in what is ultimately largely a solo endeavor, right? It's a lot of quiet time. It's a lot of time alone with your thoughts, and as you can tell, I like talking with folks. I like collaborating. I like going back and forth. So uh, I suspect I would not have been, you know, satisfied or happy with that. I don't know if that's necessarily what kind of drove the business side of my career, but it is something as you get deeper in, you realize, oh, you know what, this is maybe not the thing that I'm best suited for.
Right. But in the same regard, were there projects you worked on as a writer, as an artist, that you kind of look at as evolutionary points where you saw yourself grow in one field or the other?
Definitely. So in my 20s, I had a chance to draw a couple of things professionally, but they were short stories, and that's a very different challenge. Doing 4 to 8 to 10 pages. That's a very different challenge than doing something more long form. And I still have never drawn anything, you know, I don't think longer than 10 pages professionally. But I've had the chance to write both those short stories, then standalone single issues, and eventually a limited series. And so I think that limited series is the thing that maybe allowed me to both appreciate everything that writers and artists do on a series like that and understand it more intuitively.
Right.
And also the time that I think I grew the most. And that series was called Last Mortal. It was originally published by Top Cow and then uh, re recollected and colored by Boom Studios a number of years back.
So moving to Diamond, you're starting to see the business end of things. Uh, what was the biggest lesson you learned that you had no idea was going on prior in the industry?
What's the biggest lesson I learned at Diamond? I think perhaps just how much work it is to uh, make comics appear on comic shelves every single week.
Right.
I think those of us that, um, you know, are fans or kind of see it from the outside looking in, it's hard to fully grasp how much coordination and how many people and how much energy it takes to ensure that every single Wednesday there's new product on the shelves.
Mm-hmm.
The thing that I've often told folks when we would hire them into whether it was at Top Cow or later at Boom is that there are very few publishing businesses that publish 52 weeks out of the year. But if you are a publisher of any size in comics, you publish 52 weeks out of the year. That means you have books on the stands at Christmas, New Year's, like it really is remarkable. And I think on the Diamond side specifically, the part that folks don't understand is that, or many folks don't understand, is that the new books for this Wednesday arrived at the Diamond Warehouse on the prior Thursday. So in 6 days, 18 wheelers pull up, and then 18 wheelers go out and hit every single one of the 2,000 plus comic shops, the Diamond services in the world. And now, there are other distributors doing that as well. Um, but it's really pretty miraculous that it runs as smoothly as it does.
Was it also, because you'd mentioned earlier about the importance of meeting deadlines in comics, being on this side of it as well, did you get to learn a lesson about really that it is like companies can hemorrhage money on a missed
Mhm.
deadline, or because there's still money has to go in even if the book doesn't go out?
Yeah, I mean, I think if I'm following your question, I would agree that, one of the biggest things about being, whether you're a distributor or a publisher, a retailer,
Right.
the top priority is probably timeliness.
Right.
As an example, at Diamond, when I was in the purchasing department, we had, um, uh, statistics that we tracked with publishers. And if you couldn't deliver your product when you said you were going to deliver it, you didn't get to solicit more product. And when I got to um, to Boom, one of our focuses was how do we get to 95% on time. So if we say we're going to deliver this, originally it was just within the month.
Mhm.
Like if we say it's going to ship in August, it's going to release in one of these 4 weeks in August. Eventually, when we moved to the premiere section of the catalog, we made a commitment to uh, publicly announce our release dates and to have a 95% on time track record for that specific date. So 3 months out, if you saw this book is going to be in stores August 7th, you count on it being in stores on August 7th. And I think at our peak, we stopped tracking sometime in 2018 or 2019 because we were at 99% on time. And at a certain point, this seems to be running pretty well. We probably don't need to track this anymore. Now, I don't know, off the top of my head, post pandemic, we probably had, some more fluctuations just because of the disruption in the supply chain in general. But
Mhm.
um, it was a paramount importance.
I think, because I think we're the same age. When we were collecting Image comics in the early 90s, there were certain books that it would come out, and then issue two wasn't coming out for 5, 6 months after that. And
Mhm.
because of that, you sort of lose interest because you're like, well, I guess this just isn't happening. So it shows what you said right there that, getting it at 99%, that's going to keep your readers happy and it's going to keep them coming back knowing they
Yeah.
can depend on this coming out.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, and part of the reason I think that happened in the 90s, I actually had a story shared with me years ago when I was working at Top Cow, and I won't necessarily name any names here, but I was having a conversation with with one of the folks that had been there a long time and had been in Image Comics in those early 90s, those kind of heady launch days. And I asked, I was like, oh man, it just seemed like this person was really inconsistent. And they said, what's crazy is this particular artist was actually very fast. They could draw an issue of a comic book in about 2.5 weeks. But the problem was it was so competitive at that time and the artist was so hot. They were getting paid, I forget what the amount was, but say $25,000 an issue in 1993, 1994. So they were in their early 20s.
Mhm.
So if somebody cut you a check
Right.
for 25 grand
Yeah,
in 1993 for 2.5 weeks of work and you lived in Southern California, what would you do? You would go surf for a month
exactly.
because it was more money than you needed,
Right.
right? And and there wasn't a training system there necessarily to teach those folks that were breaking in at the time, like, hey, here's how you build like a long-term career, because they had no reason to think that this wasn't the way that it was always going to be, right? um and I think that is, not that I'm advocating that, uh you know you need times to be tough in order to build good habits, but oftentimes, it's been my experience that we learn more when things are a little bit more challenging versus when things are going really well, right? But yeah, I agree. I think that's something incredibly important, is to be something that your customers and your fans can count on. So even if you take a look at something like um, Boom, obviously has had a tremendous amount of success with Something is Killing the Children. Now, James and Werther knew that they were not going to be able to produce, or you know didn't want to make the sacrifices, and there, believe me, there are incredible sacrifices that have to be made in order to get 12 issues out a year. So, but what we did, working with James and Werther and the editorial team there, was said, okay, each arc is going to be 5 issues. There's going to be a break of a predictable amount of months in between this arc and the next arc. We're going to have a planned program to get collections out in between that time period, and we're going to let fans know this is what you can expect. This arc is wrapping, it's got a satisfying conclusion, and come back at this month to pick up the next arc of the story. And I think if you do that, a modern audience understands, because we also do that with TV and we do that with movies. As long as you tell somebody, hey, this is
Right.
when you can expect this, that's the important thing.
So does Top Cow now come to you and say we'd like you to come aboard, or you approach them and say I'd like to make the move to you guys?
The former. So I've been fortunate. I started at Diamond in the customer service department, which was a fantastic foundational year. It was essentially Comics 101. You're just picking up the phone. Back then, you were picking up the phone, and sometimes uh, having a really great conversation. Other times, a retailer is upset and they're just yelling at you because their stuff didn't show up that week. Um, but it was a great way to really understand how distribution and the comic shops work. And then a year of doing that, there was an opening in the purchasing department, which is essentially the department at Diamond that was the liaison between publishers and the distributor. And so I applied for that, got into that role, was in that seat for about 5 years, and uh, had the good fortune to be the primary point of contact at Diamond for accounts like back then the smaller accounts would have been Oni and AIT Planet Lar and um, maybe independent publishers or self publishers like Broadsword Comics or Exhibit A Press. And then at the same time, every brand manager also had larger accounts. So I started off having folks like Dynamite
Mhm.
and Dynamic Forces. When they launched, I had Dreamwave when they exploded with the revamp of Transformers. And eventually I had been there long enough to where I was um, entrusted with the Image account. And so through that, I got to know folks at Image Central, like Eric Stevenson and a number of other folks there, Jim Valentino, Eric Larson. And I also got to know the folks at Top Cow, which included Matt Hawkins, who's the president, was the president there, and is still the president there. Top Cow had kind of a unique relationship in that, again, like you said, we're about the same age, so you'll probably remember there was a point where Top Cow left Image and was on their own for a while.
Mhm.
And when they rejoined Image, they maintained their own infrastructure. So that meant that they had their own marketing and sales folks, they had their own editorial team, um, in part because Mark Silvestri never wanted to be in a position where if he disagreed with what was happening at Image Central, he couldn't again make that move to go independent. He didn't want to have to like start over. Um, so Matt and I got to know each other, and he reached out to me in it was 2006 and said, "Hey, we're looking for someone to come in and run the marketing here at Top Cow. Would you be interested?" And I said, I definitely am, because at the time, Diamond was very stable. So I had made it up to assistant manager in the purchasing department on the print team. But in looking around, the leadership team there seemed very stable to me. So it didn't seem like there was a ton of opportunity for me to continue to move up um, in the company while at least not anytime in the near future. But I had just bought a house. And so I told Matt, I said, hey, I just bought a house here outside of Baltimore. So I really can't move anytime soon. And, uh, but I would be very interested. And he said, well, I'd be comfortable with you working from Baltimore as long as you're willing to come out to LA, which again, right now doesn't seem very unusual. But in 2006, the idea of a remote work situation was very unusual. Um, and so I agreed, and I jumped into it. And 18 months or maybe 12 months into that role, he called me up again and he said, "You're doing a great job on the marketing side." We just This would have been heading into 2008. We had the Witchblade anime series had been produced in Japan and was getting ready to come over to the US through Funimation. The Wanted film was in production, and the Darkness video game was in production. And Matt said, I need to focus on these cross media efforts that we have and the success we're having here. So would you be interested in taking on the publisher role? I said, yeah, that sounds great. I'd be really interested in that.
Mhm.
And he said, the catch is that I do need you to move to LA because if you're going to be running the team, I need you here in person. So in 2008, I made the leap to LA and been here ever since.
And you bring up a really interesting point about, the cross promotions to get the word out. Because when you and I were growing up, there was a spinner rack in almost every store. I mean,
Mhm.
comics were everywhere, and now that's sort of disappeared. So, in your opinion, how does one get their name out there in the comic world if you're not DC and Marvel putting out, movies every year?
Well, there's a variety of ways. I mean, the great news is that the comic shop market is really well established, right? And one of the things that um, I love talking about is how comic shops are ultimately, in my opinion, they are a third place. And if you're familiar with that idea, it's you have work, you have home, and then you have some sort of third place, and traditionally that might be, you know, the coffee shop or the local bar or the Elks Club or whatever organization you want to be part of, your church or whatever. Um, and I think for a lot of people, because comics can often be a thing that is not just a source of entertainment, but also a source of identity, become that third place. And I think nothing reinforces that more than the fact that right now there are a dozen places that you could find comics cheaper and easier than your local comic shop. But the act of going in, whether you're somebody that goes in every Wednesday or every once in a while, and having a place that you can find community, but also a place where you can get recommendations from somebody that is an expert and maybe understands what your tastes are and how you might respond to particular material. I think that's key. So that is incredibly powerful tool in the toolbox as someone who markets comic books, especially if you're from a smaller company, right? Because you can go to comic shops, to the store owners, to the managers, to the people working the counter and say, hey, let me get you excited about what I'm doing. And if I get you excited, then you're going to get your customers excited. And that was something when I went to Top Cow, I knew was that this was a company that had fantastic brands, Witchblade and Darkness and Cyberforce and all of the things that they had published over the years wanted had really resonated and had a lot of love and affection within that space. And so oftentimes it was just about finding a fresh angle on what we were doing to get folks excited.
Right. And this question kind of goes with Top Cow and with Boom, but is the mentality you guys are competition to DC, Marvel, let's say Image, or an alternative to DC, Marvel, Image, something the fans can get that they're not necessarily getting from the other companies.
I think it depends on the day,
Okay.
to be perfectly honest. I don't know. Comics is interesting as an industry in that it is small and people move from company to company uh, fairly routinely. And so, as a result, with the exception of maybe Marvel and DC at different points in their history, those rivalries could be very real. I think most of the other folks in the space viewed it as um, not direct competition, but we were competing for the same customer's attention.
Mhm.
So in that way, we were competing, but we weren't. We were rarely selling the exact same flavor of ice cream, right? So it was just a question of, you know, hey, Warren, today, do you feel like chocolate, or do you feel like Rocky Road, or do you feel like, mint chocolate chip? And depending on what you felt like, that was going to determine who you were going to. Now, um, within that, publishers certainly compete with each other for talent, for different projects. You know, if Tom King is only going to do one new original series this year, then you can bet there's going to be multiple publishers vying to get that project. But it's a little bit like playing sports, right? Like when you're on the field, you're fighting your hardest and you're pushing to win as much as you can, and then afterwards, you go get a beer with the people that you played football with, and they're like, oh, okay, we're fine.
So jump fast forward a little bit. You become president of publishing at Boom. Day one, in your mind, what's working and what's not working? What's the first thing you want to implement?
So when I joined Boom, the first question I had for Ross, who founded the company, was I I know that y'all have been having success, and I've been tracking the company closely enough to pay attention and see when they were having moments of success, whether it was with Irredeemable or when they first got into licensing with Farscape, or at that time when I started the company, Adventure Time was really starting to pop. Um, but my question was, I don't understand how the company that publishes Peanuts also publishes Hellraiser, and I don't understand who the customer is if those are kind of the two ends of the spectrum.
Right.
And Ross's response was essentially, I think, something that drove a lot of entrepreneurs that started comic book publishers in the mid 2000s, which was comics were starting to break into the mainstream just a little bit, whether it was the Bryan Singer X-Men movies or the Sam Raimi Spider-Man films, um, the influence of Vertigo in the late 90s and early 2000s, Sandman bringing in a different type of reader. Um, and so there was this feeling in the mid aughts that um, the market could really attract a broader group of readers into comic shops if the material was made available for them. And so I think Ross's guiding principle when he started the company was really, how do we put together commercial and elevated material that appeals not just to people that are already in comic shops, but those folks that are coming in from outside. And within that, that's a very broad, and so the first thing that I really did, and it was primarily on the marketing side, was say, okay, well, how do we pull that together into an identity and into some messaging that helps people understand how all these things fit under one publisher, why they should have brand loyalty to us as a publisher, even though we publish all these different things. And that resulted in the We Are Boom marketing campaign. So uh, that was really a way of saying, look, here's who we are, but also this is why you are Boom as well. And the marketing tagline we came up with was, "We are Boom. Come innovate with us." And we would use that to kind of point to all the different ways we were innovating and changing the market, which Boom had done for the 7 years prior to my coming there. When the company launched, uh, Ross launched with anthologies, which everybody, including me at Diamond, because I was the person Ross was talking to, at Diamond said anthologies don't work. You're always judged by not the best story in the anthology, but the worst story in the anthology. And he said, I think I can put together an anthology that will buck the trend. And that first year, Zombie Tales and then Ninja Tales and Pirate Tales really worked for him. And you can see now with Hello Darkness and the EC Comics revival and a number of these other anthology projects that, again, we're coming cyclically back to anthologies as being something that works. And so they had done that with anthologies. They had produced licensed comics that were incredibly well regarded and critically acclaimed and even had won awards, which, again, conventional wisdom at the time was that licensed comics were not very good.
Right.
That they were just kind of a thing that publishers did to cash in on an existing fan base and kind of got in and got out.
Right.
They had done that with, you know, bringing Mark Waid over to create a superhero comic that was, I think, for a lot of folks, irredeemable and incorruptible, or kind of their Kingdom Come, their Watchmen, their first gateway in, where they saw that, oh, you can do a superhero comic book and it could be a deconstruction and it can be mature. It can be really kind of looking at the tropes of superhero comics and taking a fresh look at it. So that was the first thing, and it worked really well. We got a really good response to it. We were able to get a bunch of creators on board. The creators got excited around it. And I think it helped frame Boom in a different and more cohesive light than maybe it had been framed up until that point.
And you just mentioned before about licensed properties. I've spoken to Jim Shooter and Greg Goldstein, and we were talking about licensed properties, and both said that they thought they were very important, because if a fan sees something that they know and they'll pick it up, like, oh, I know G.I. Joe, I know Transformers, they like that, then maybe they'll say, well, let's see what else this publisher puts out, and maybe they'll get original content that you guys are putting out as well. Was that the mentality that you had too?
Yeah, absolutely. But the critical thing there, and Marvel's a great example of in the heyday when they were doing licensing, and now post Star Wars they've come back into it,
Right.
of doing that, executing that strategy really well.
Mm-hmm.
And what I mean by that is licenses can be a phenomenal gateway into comics and into a particular company. But if you don't treat them with the same care and attention as you would treat your wholly owned
Right.
properties, then it might be somebody's first and last comic book, right? And I think we all remember, picking up that licensed comic that was like, oh man, I love this thing, or I love this thing when I was a kid, and you pick it up and you're like, I don't ever need to read this. I don't even understand why this was made, right? And that was something that at Boom editorially they believed really strongly. Books like Planet of the Apes were a great example of that, where people were picking up these Planet of the Apes comics in 2011, 2012 from Boom and saying, oh man, I don't even like Planet of the Apes. I was not expecting it to be this good.
Right.
And I think one of the greatest success stories while I was at Boom of something like that was Power Rangers, where, again, we're of a similar age. So Power Rangers for me was already too late. When that debuted, I looked at it and I went, that looks really cheesy to me. But it wasn't for me, it was for kids, right? And we had a bunch of people working at the company that grew up on Power Rangers and had a lot of affection for it. And Bryce Carlson, who is VP of editorial now, at the time he was managing editor, was one of those fans, and he had this great insight that what we should do is we should make a Power Rangers comic that makes you feel like you felt like when you were 10 or 12 years old watching that show, but we should not try to replicate the show. We should replicate the emotion.
Mm-hmm.
And that, I think, is why that series, has run for 7, 8 years compared to if you look at the rest of the publishing history for Power Rangers, they could never get more than like 12 issues out of that franchise because everybody was trying to recreate the show.
Mhm.
The problem is the audience isn't 12 anymore, you
Right.
know? And yeah, and coming, using those licensed books as a way to onboard fans and then transition them or introduce them to new original concepts and hopefully create, fans for out of them for those properties as well.
When someone comes to you to pitch a story or an idea, what are some of the things that you're looking for specifically to say, okay, I think this is going to have legs to it?
Um, I think on an instinctual level, the first thing that you want to feel as somebody who's reading the pitch for the first time is like, are you surprised and delighted by what is being kicked over to you? Is this an idea that you, oh, I never thought about that, or oh, that's interesting. Tell me more.
Mhm.
Um, and then, if you have that kind of reaction, then the questions after that you ask yourselves are, um, who are the characters? Do they seem interesting and rich and complex enough to support more than just a story?
Mhm.
What's the world like? What are the stakes? And do I feel like there's an opportunity for the characters to grow and change
Mhm.
over a period of time? Um, and I would say that beyond that, you need to either know that the creator has whether it's the writer or the artist has the ability to deliver the work and to execute the story because ideas are actually the easiest part of creating any kind of content. Um, when I was at Top Cow uh, as the publisher, I would spend a lot of time doing portfolio reviews, and I would spend a lot of time talking to aspiring writers. And without fail, at every convention, I would get a number of people coming up to me and saying, oh, "I've got this great idea. It's like this multi-year epic. I've been working on it for years. I have this whole world built out and these characters, and it's going to be the next Star Wars, or it's going to be the next Game of Thrones or Walking Dead, or pick your thing." And the question I would always ask is, well, how many? First of all, how much of it have you actually written? Like, how many scripts have you written? And usually the answer was none. Um, and then the second related question was, well, how many scripts have you written in general? You know,
Mhm.
because if the answer is just a handful, then you haven't put in your 10,000 hours and you're probably not going to be able to execute your magnum opus, right? So you need to start small and you need to put the reps in. And I think that is, you know, one of the big topics right now. And I think things that as a society we're going to be grappling with, and certainly the creative community is grappling with, is this idea of using artificial intelligence as a shortcut to putting in the time.
Mhm.
It's like, well, I have this idea. It's like, yeah, the the great pieces of fiction that stand the test of time rarely were they about the idea. It was almost always about the execution, right? And one of my favorite examples of this is Star Wars.
Mhm.
Star Wars is literally George Lucas's mashup of his favorite things, and there are dissertations of people breaking down. Here's what he took from Kurosawa, and here's what he took from the Bible, and here's what he took from Flash Gordon, and
Mhm.
like the idea of Star Wars is not particularly original.
Right.
It's the execution that is original.
Mhm.
It's the way that he put all those pieces together and the world that he built and the characters that he built and how they interacted with each other that has allowed it to be something that we're still fascinated with, you know, 45 years later.
When you're putting a book together and you're putting the talent on each book, is the thought, okay, this is the right person for this arc, or is the thought this is this right person for a 3 or 4 year run on the book if it's successful?
It depends on the project, and I should say, at Boom, where I was for 12 years, that kind of work was very firmly in the camp of our editorial department, right? So the editor chief, Matt Gagnon, the VP of editorial, Bryce Carlson, that was really the strategy that they were in charge of. And my role, um, as the president of publishing and marketing, was to look at what they had put together and say, I think this has commercial appeal. I think this is how we can market this. This is how we can sell this. Or here are my concerns about X, Y, or Z. Um, but I think in general, my approach would not be that different from theirs, which is if it's something that's pre-existing, let's say it's a long-running series and the original creative team wants to step away and work on something else, or it's a licensed series, you're generally looking for a creative team that can be on a project for at least a year.
Right.
And you want them to be able to tell a story that has ebbs and flows and takes the audience on a journey. Now, occasionally there are going to be times in between stories, or maybe there's a scheduling issue. You just need somebody to step in. We need you to do one issue, or we need you to be able to do this one arc to bridge us from this creative team to that creative team. And that's a little bit more of an editorial publishing strategy decision. When it comes to original content, you are usually, as an editor and as a publisher, trying to put together the best band you can. So the best projects from a publishing perspective come down to good casting, right? So sometimes the team comes to you and you're seeing that and identifying and saying, wow, there's some magic here with these two or three people working together. And sometimes the project is coming in and it's just the writer and you're seeing their pitch and saying, okay, I've had my eye on this artist over here and they haven't had their breakout moment, but there's something about the way they're telling stories visually that I think if we put them together with this writer is going to create magic. And at Boom, there was a terrific history of that. One of the things that I think makes Boom unique and incredibly strong as a publisher is that their editorial team is collaborative with the creators that they work with. And what I mean by that is at other companies, each editor might have their Rolodex of talent, and that's something that they protect, right? I have a relationship with this person, this person, this person. And so when I call them, they're going to do my book. Right. At Boom, projects would come in and the editors would get together and collaborate on who do we think would be the best fit for this project. And sometimes that meant an editor was giving up a reliable piece of talent on their project to set up something else. A terrific example of that is Daphne Plebin discovered Dan Mora and was the first person to give him work in North America, and had him first on Hexed and Klaus, but then had put him on Power Rangers. Right. And Dan was killing it on Power Rangers and is a gigantic Power Rangers fan. Dan probably would have kept drawing Power Rangers, for years. Okay. But the pitch came in for Once and Future from Kieran Gillen, and the team looked at that and said, identified correctly that like Dan was going to be the artist that could visualize, that story, and that his very commercial kinetic art style was going to take that project from being something that was maybe a little expected from Kieran to something that had a different commercial appeal and could be a bridge for people that maybe wouldn't have picked up a Kieran Gillen book naturally.
Well, there's been some news the past few months about yourself moving on to new projects. How do you come to a decision that this is the right move? Because you've had so much success with Boom, and before previously with Top Cow. How do you tell yourself, what? Let me try this.
Yeah, great question. Well, yeah, I did just recently. It's almost a month now. Yeah. Been gone from Boom, which is I'm still training myself not to say we
Right.
or I or they, like saying they're doing this or Boom's doing this,
Mm,
because I was there for 12 years,
right.
which is a you know a lifetime in comic books.
Right.
um, and really, what it came down to was I at the same time as the company was engaged in conversations with Penguin Random House about a potential acquisition and that becoming a new phase in the company's history, which is really exciting, and that's something that they're still working through right now. They're in the process of they've entered into an agreement to be acquired, and they're in the
Mm,
process of closing that agreement. And that was a really exciting opportunity for somebody like me because I had spent the last 18 years working at small and mid-sized companies. And when I say mid-sized, Boom had grown to 50 plus people, which is in the grand scheme of things still relatively
right.
small, right? Um, and so the idea of potentially taking the next phase of my career and working within a uh, multinational, you know, company that had 200 imprints and all this amazing infrastructure and resources was really interesting and exciting. I thought that um, Random House's decision to acquire Boom was a validation of everything we had done for the past decade, and also a clear sign that they were committed to comic books, which was really exciting. So the idea of working for the world's largest trade publisher and putting all those resources, bringing all those resources to bear for a comic book company, a single issue publishing company at the same time, was really exciting. And then uh, right around the time that that opportunity was starting to crystallize, and I was starting to have conversations with PRH about what that might look like,
Mm,
I was approached by someone who called me up and said, "Hey, what would you be interested in starting a new comic book publisher from the ground up and essentially doing it the way that you've always wanted to do it, as opposed to jumping into somebody else's vision and helping grow that and build that?"
right.
And that was a really intriguing question.
Mhm.
Um, and uh, ultimately, it was funny. I spent a long time kind of making pros and cons lists. I'm a very organized person, so I had a whole spreadsheet of here are the risks and here are the rewards and here are the opportunities. And I had done my due diligence. It felt like the opportunity was real and it had the necessary resources for me to actually do what I wanted to do. Um, and as I was weighing the two options, I was having a conversation with my wife. We've been married for a long time. We've been together 20 years or so all together. And she kind of looked at me and she said, "You already know what you're going to do." Uh, I said, "What do you mean?" She goes, "Well, you know that you have to go do this because if you don't, the question will eat at you for the next 10 years. What could have been? And if somebody else does it, you're either going to be mad that they got to answer that question or that they didn't answer it the right way."
Right.
Um, and she was right, as my wife often is. So that's what it really came down to, is just this chance to you know going back to the beginning of our conversation, being that kid in Roanoke, Virginia, making his own comic books with his friends,
Right.
being able to say, okay, here's a blank sheet of paper,
Mhm.
and what does this look like
Yeah.
to you, right?
And I know you're still putting things together, but if you could just fill people in a little bit who want to do certain things, when you're putting this blueprint together, what should be the first step for somebody who wants to do something like this?
Um, One of my favorite authors and thought leaders is a guy named Simon Sinek, and if you haven't checked him out, I highly recommend checking him out. He's got one of the most viewed TED Talks ever, and guy's last name is spelled Sinek,
Mhm.
and he's written a number of books. And the first book is one of the ones that has been most influential to me, which is "It Starts with Why." So that is what I would tell somebody if they were going to start any company, whether it's a comic book publisher or anything else. The first question you should ask yourself is why. Um, most folks that start companies or work at companies know what they do. They might know how they do it, but a lot of organizations and a lot of people don't know why they do what they do.
Right.
And so, you know, I'm working with a handful of other folks that are going on this journey with me,
Mhm.
that are my partners, and we spent the first full week, the first few days, really digging into that question of why, and let's get aligned on that, figure out why we're all here, and what we're hoping to, what is answering that question successfully look like to us.
To say it's got to be very exciting after all the work you've done, and like you said, going back to the very beginning, putting your own comics together. The possibilities are absolutely endless for you guys, and I say you must wake up every day just excited, like, okay, what's going to happen now?
Yeah, absolutely. And the challenge, I think, is narrowing it down, like, and that was one of my favorite moments at Boom, was when we hit a tipping point where we weren't so worried about how are we going to get from this week to the next week. Because when you're in that mode, you're making decisions that you have to make. And so
Right.
you're saying yes to things that help you get to the next stage, right? And uh, there was a moment at Boom where we had successfully scaled the company to a point where there were more fish hopping into the boat than we could manage,
Right.
and we could start to say, no, not right now, that's not for us, right? And that can be one of the hardest things to do, is to figure out, and it's almost just as important to figure out what you're going to say no to
Right.
as to what you're going to say yes to. But yeah, it's only been a few weeks of really uh, building that blueprint, but every day is exciting, and a little bit scary, as it should be. Richard Branson said, "If your dreams don't scare you, you're probably not dreaming big enough." And I tend to agree. So there's a little bit of anxiety there, but it's the type of anxiety that fuels you, and gets you excited.
I was just saying, and it's getting a lot of people excited because I mean this news spread pretty fast, and folks are very curious and very excited about seeing where this is going. But looking back from this point backwards, is there a project you worked on that you look at and say, this I'm the proudest of?
Um, yeah, I think that there were a couple of things at Boom that I'm incredibly proud to be have had a part of. And I think the thing that I would also always make sure people are tracking is that comics, maybe more than most creative art forms, commercial creative art forms, is an incredible team sport, right? So all these things that I'm going to talk about, I played some small piece in it, but ultimately, um, I wouldn't take credit for any of it. There's an incredible team behind it, but things like Lumberjanes is something that I'm incredibly proud of. One of the reasons I moved to Boom was I had just had my first daughter, and I looked at the stuff I was publishing at Top Gun. I go, I can't hand any of this to my kid, and I want to be someplace where Dad can bring home what he's working on, and pass it along. And um, both I have two daughters. Both of them grew up being Lumberjanes fans, not because I made them, but because I just left the stuff around the house, and they gravitated toward it and they responded to it. Um, and I genuinely believe that what Shannon and Nate and Gus and Grace created, and all the other creators that came after them, uh, was a catalyst for a real meaningful shift in comics, not just in the direct market, but in the book market. So incredibly proud of that. And then I'm also incredibly proud to have been part of Something is Killing the Children of Berserker, because I think those are both landmark, independently published original comic books. Um, and I think already folks are trying to replicate those things and figure out how to make that happen again. Um, And that is really exciting to see. And it's really exciting to see those creative teams continue to like build those properties and make them something that I think are going to stand the test of time.
This is usually a very easy question, but considering you're still in the infancy with this new project, is there things fans can look forward to? Is there, the stuff coming out or anything that fans can, be on the lookout for?
Well, I'll answer that question two ways. One, having just left Boom, I will tell folks that are watching or listening, you should definitely be on the lookout for Minor Arcana by Jeff Lemire. It is going to be a really exciting new series. If you love Vertigo, if you love Jeff's work, this is his first written and drawn ongoing series since Sweet Tooth.
Okay.
So it's one to pay attention to. Um, and I think it combines everything that Jeff does brilliantly, which is small town, uh, family dynamics, small town dynamics with a really clever high concept and elements of the supernatural. And it's just going to be really cool. So definitely recommend folks keep an eye out for that. And then for the new thing, what's really fun is we're not under any pressure to rush out and bring stuff to market. So I would just say for anybody that is curious or interested, I think in the next couple weeks we'll be announcing who's involved, and from there we'll start to drop little breadcrumbs about what we have planned. But my hope is that what folks can look forward to is being surprised and in a and hopefully delighted, in what we do. Um, I really hope that we can take the things that people love about independent comic books and um, make this inviting, and at the same time maybe take some of the things that folks have gotten frustrated with or um, uh, haven't had great experiences with, and if not fix those things, improve the way things are done.
We are back. Philip is one of the nicest people you are going to meet. It's really interesting to hear how his career trajectory went from writing to working for Diamond and Boom and, to where he is now. Uh, you learn a lot about the inside part of the industry that maybe we don't, know so much as fans, but he is going to do something wonderful with this company. I mean, it is a group of talent that it can't fail. It just can't fail. And we wish him all the best. We can't wait to have him back on to talk about what they're going to be doing in the future. So, Philip, good luck. Thanks so much for joining us, and we can't wait to hear all about it. And as I've said before, hey, listen, gang, we are finalists for two awards for the CBC Awards. We are absolutely honored. We are dumbfounded, flabbergasted, because we didn't think we'd ever get to this point, but here we are. So please, 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 this weekend, tell your friends, tell your family, go to cbcawards.org. We are the first two categories, first two or first three. I think it's the first two categories. Please vote for us, and then go vote for the other wonderful talent on the ballot as well. They are all awesome, awesome. I watch a lot of those shows myself, but if we can get this, oh, dude, that'd be pretty, maybe a feather in our caps, and it can maybe open more doors for us. So we'll see what happens. But the most important thing is you have yourselves a wonderful Labor Day weekend. Announcement coming this weekend about the shows for the next few weeks, the next couple of months that I think you're going to really like a lot. So be on the lookout for that. Enjoy the barbecues, and we will see you next week.